All right, so this week we're going to get started with selection statements. And selection statements allow us to give computers instructions on how to make decisions. So we use something called conditionals in order to help the computer know if it needs what decision it needs to make, say out of a list of decisions. Now, all of our conditionals are going to evaluate to either true or false. So here is where we start talking about those Boolean values, and a Boolean value can either be true or it can be false. It just has two options. All right, so let's say we want to know, we want to set up some condition, and we know that this condition needs to evaluate to one of these two. It needs to be either true or false. We have some different ways to do this. So if we're thinking about numbers, we can compare numbers to each other, and based on how they compare, this will work out to be true or false. So for instance, we can compare if two numbers are equal to each other. Equivalent, we use the double equal sign. Remember, one equal sign is assignment in Python. If we want to use to do a comparison as if two things are equal, we use a double equal sign. And it's different in other languages. Some languages just use the equal sign for both. Some use other characters to do the equivalency. So you want to check the syntax of whatever language that you're using. But we can compare to see if two numbers are equal to each other. We can compare to see if they're not equal to each other. So for instance, 5 equals 5, this evaluates to true. 5 equals 6, this evaluates to false. 5 does not equal 6, well, that's true. In addition to these two, we can check if things are greater than, less than, I think I said those backwards, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. So we can compare numerical values to each other, and based on the outcome, we're going to get either true or false Boolean value from that comparison. Python will actually let you use these for strings as well. So if I had the string hi, and I wanted to know if that was equal to hi, this would be true. However, this with a capital H, this would be false. So this would not be true. Other languages don't allow you to use these operators with strings. You have to use special methods instead, but we're lucky with Python. We can actually compare two strings to each other to see if they're equal or not equal. These work as well, but they kind of work weird. It has to do with ASCII and sort of alphabetizing. You can play with those and kind of see what you get as a result. It's not something you would use very commonly, but you may find some use for it, that Python also allows you to use these operators with strings. So these are some basic operators we can use to create conditionals, but there's more. So in Python, we also have the in keyword. So this is mostly used with strings and lists. So you can check if a character is present in a string, then it would return true. Otherwise, it would return false. So something like, the letter A in cat, this would be true. If we asked for the letter D in cat, this would be false. The is keyword can also be used to return a Boolean. We also have methods for strings as well as I do believe there's a few for lists that will return a Boolean value that we can use in conditionals. And these are going to be pretty useful for us when we get to strings. They're things like the isDigit method, which I can give this a string, say 5C, and this would return false. IsDigit returns true if all the characters in a string are a numerical digit. It returns false otherwise. So if I had, 55 dot isDigit, that would return true. So we'll get more practice with those when we get to the section on strings, which won't be till after we get through loops. But so there's more than just the operators that we can use. We can use anything in our selection statements as well as conditionals for our loops when we get to loops next week. Anything that returns true or false can be used as a conditional in an if statement, in a for loop, in a while loop. So this week we're focusing on if statements, but in conditionals, in loops, we also use conditionals as well. So we can combine conditionals. We don't just have to use conditionals on their own. We can actually combine them to make more complex conditionals. We do that with, we have three keywords. We've got and, we have or, and we have not. Now, there's actually a lot more than this. There's NAND and XOR and NOR. There's a lot of other conditionals. We won't be using them in this class. In this class, we're just going to use and, or, and not. So these are all you'll be held accountable for in terms of assessment. These are the simplest, and they're also really the most useful. There are plenty of cases to use the more complex ones, but it will be a while before you get there, and you'll learn about them plenty when you start studying computer organization. So the way and works is if you have, when you're basically combining two conditionals. So you have some sort of conditional and another conditional. So this could be something like x equals 5 and y does not equal 6, right? Something like this. So when we're looking at these two conditionals, the and means that both of them have to be true for the entire thing to be true. All right, so if we're looking at condition 1, we're looking at condition 2. If condition 1 is true and condition 2 is true, then the whole thing is true. Otherwise, it's false. If one of them is true and the other is false, the whole thing is false. If the first is false and the second is true, the whole thing is false. And if both are false, well, the whole thing is false. So if I had something like x equals 7 and y equals 9, okay, so x equals 5, that's false. Y does not equal 6, that's true. False and true. False and true means the whole thing is false. So that's how we look at an and. A not simply means take the opposite. So if you have something that is true and you say not true, it becomes false. If you have something that is false and you say not false, it becomes true. So if I said not x equals 5 equals 5 and x does equal 5, well, x equals 5 is true, but not true is false. Or is probably the trickiest. It works a little bit different than we think of or in the English language. When we have two conditions, so we have condition 1 or condition 2, and we have something like this. We have x equals 5 or y does not equal 6. We're going to take a look at condition 1 and condition 2. All right, so if condition 1 is false and condition 2 is false, the whole thing is false. If condition 1 is true and condition 2 is false, the whole thing is still true. If condition 1 is false and condition 2 is true, the whole thing is true. And if both are true, the whole thing is true. So the thing to remember about or is if any one of them is true, the whole thing is true. So if one is true, the whole thing is true. If the other is true, the whole thing is true. If both are true, the whole thing is true. That's a little bit different than the way we use or in English. We might say to someone, you can have ice cream or you can have cake. We usually mean you can pick one or the other. You can't have both. But in computer science, or means you also get both, and it's still true. So in this example, let's say I've got x is equal to 5 and y is equal to 6. In this case, x equals 5, well, that's true. Y does not equal 6, well, that's false. But still, since this one is true, the whole thing is true. So let's take a look at how conditionals work in Python. Let's just type some in and see what we get. So let's say we have something like 7 equals 8. So that's false, right? 7 does not equal 8. If I say 7 does not equal 8, that's going to be true. Let's say I say 87 is greater than or equal to 45. True. So you see, you can come and play with these. I'm just playing with these right in the shell and kind of see how Python works. Again, so let's do something like this. Hi does not equal, hit enter too soon. All right, so let's say hi does not equal hi with a capital H. So this should be true. These are not equal to each other. And actually, I needed to make sure I use double equals. A single equals is just for assignment. So doing this, that's false. So these are different ASCII values. The lowercase h is a different ASCII value than the uppercase h. So these are not the same. The only way for a string to be equal to another string is that every character has to be equal. So even if I had something like this, hi, and I say equals equals hi, and I put a space in between this exclamation point and this our quotation, that adds the ASCII character of a blank space to that string. So now those strings are no longer equal to each other. So again, play around with these and kind of see what you get. Now let's try to do some more complex ones with and or with some of our different operators that we have. Well, let me show you first. So if I've got a in cat, right? So the letter A is in cat, that's going to be true. But if I had the letter B in dog, there's no letter B there, so that's going to be false. If I ask something like, is B B, that's true. If I ask something like 1 is the string of 1, that's false. So is another keyword that we can use, and it's basically going to compare two things and tell you if they're the same. So let's see, 1 is 1, that's true. And this is going to become more useful, and is has some really interesting rules because it's really sort of looking at where you're pointing in memory. So as we get further along and we do more cool and interesting stuff, you'll get to see is will come in handy for us to actually see what our variables are pointing to. All right, so moving on to something a little more complicated. Let's combine some of these with and or and see what we get. All right, so let's say we've got 4 does not equal 4 and 3 is greater than 2. Okay, so 4 does not equal 4. This is false. 4 does equals 4. Well, we don't have an x. I meant to say 3. 3 is greater than 2. Well, this is true. But since this is false, the whole thing is going to be false. All right, so the only way, if we did equals equals 4 and 3 greater than 2, when we use an and, this is only going to be true if they both are true. On the other hand, if I have something like 4 does not equal 4 or 3 is greater than 2, well, in this case, it should be true because only one of these has to be true for this to be true. And it's also the case that if both of them are true, it will also be true when we use an or statement. If I have something like not 4 is not equal to 4, so 4 is not equal to 4, so that's false, but I said not false, so that is going to be true. So play around with these, come up with some of your own. There's some practice problems on the practice sheets for you to go through, for you to be able to understand conditionals. Conditionals are going to be, we're going to use them in selection statements this week, and then as soon as we get to loops, we're going to use them as well, and then you're going to have all sorts of superpowers with programming. So yay, programming!